My memories danced along the ceiling before I drifted off to sleep, now 26, remembering Jeffrey. That summer, I was getting ready for the second grade. We lived in the middle of nowhere in the home where my parents reside to this very day. The neighborhood was placed along the border of a woodsy area where I wasn't allowed to play at my young age without supervision. However, since the neighborhood was so desolate and the people that were there knew one another, I was able to get some exploring in. That summer, the explorations consisted of walking down the straight road from our house to a playground that was entirely abandoned. There was no upkeep, but the equipment was fun to climb on, and there was a treehouse, something I didn't have in my own backyard. My parents were slightly reluctant to allow me to go alone at almost 8, standing there and asking, "Can I please go down the street and I promise I'll be careful?" But my mother was baking that day and our bay window looked out to the playground. Though it was far off in the distance, she would be able to see that I was there and telling the truth, and surely be able to hear me screaming if somebody were to try and pick me up. I remember running to the park the first day, and on that very first day was when I met Jeffrey, the boy in the treehouse. He was sitting in the corner of the giant square-shaped abode, a slide passing through that strung out in 2 different directions and a ladder to get inside. You can imagine my surprise as I climbed the stairs ready to play and pretend that I was an explorer, only to stop dead in my tracks when I saw a boy sitting in there already, as equally stunned to see me. I remember his face went from a shocked "oh" to a solid smile as it curved upwards, and I couldn't help but to do the same. We introduced ourselves and talked about our families, both relating to the fact that we had no siblings and nothing else to do in these summer months. As much as I liked Jeffrey, his aversion to never wanting to go out and play was the only thing that got me. From day one, he was there every day on the weekends when I would go to the park, reading his little comic books in the corner. I remember the pages of the comics being littered with beautiful-looking women much older than myself, pursing their lips like they were about to give a kiss, but whenever I would try to look over his shoulder, he would shyly pull them away and say that they were secret. Jeffrey liked nothing other than sitting up there and talking about himself and me, his new best friend. A couple of times that summer I told him that we should go out and look around the tree line since we were bordering the woods, but he shook his head and said he didn't like being outside. I asked him multiple times if he wanted to come and play at my house, that my parents would like that I met a friend, but again, he continued to tell me that he felt uncomfortable with that idea, and would want me to sit closer to him as we did things like drawing and playing board games in that nearly dilapidated treehouse. A treehouse that no longer stands in our neighborhood to this day. One day by the middle of summer, I went to the treehouse and Jeffrey was reading his comics again, smiling when he greeted me. "Can I come sleep over tonight?" The question struck me as a surprise. Now, from what you may have gathered, my parents were quite strict. At this point, I hadn't said anything about Jeffrey to them. That's fine and dandy. As I said, me communicating with another kid in the neighborhood was something that they would have loved, because it was me branching out and meeting people rather than being locked up or creating trouble. But, 1, I had never asked anyone over for a sleepover in my life, and 2, my nearly 8-year-old brain became instantly nervous at the fact that a boy would be sleeping over at my house. I wondered what my parents would think. Even at this age, the thought of sleeping in the same room with a boy seemed like something they would outright reject, something that seemed a little off. I told him about my concerns in the best way I could, and I remember him looking at me sneakily and saying, "Just leave your bedroom window open tonight, and then I'll sneak in if you want me to come." And although I don't remember much about that entire day, I do remember the chills I had at the thought of doing something so huge behind my parents' backs, but thinking it was the coolest thing ever that I was going to have a sleepover. And so I told Jeffrey that, yes, I would do that tonight. I told him to look for the open window on the far left side of the house and that he could even sleep in my bed. That we could quietly watch movies all night and eat snacks. He was so excited about the idea. Suddenly, my memories of Jeffrey cut short. I vaguely pieced together the rest as I lie in bed, remembering my parents screaming at each other, at me, and cutting me off from the adventurous lifestyle that I had. I remember growing up and being put on a leash, only to cut myself free when I turned 17. I remember my first real boyfriend and not bringing him home to my overprotective parents. I remember finding bloody bed sheets in the woods out behind my house, trying to conjure a memory in my mind, but coming up short. I remember not allowing my boyfriend to put his hands on me, the fight we had, the way he told me that it must have been because I was already used, the breakup, coming back home and my parents telling me that I was safe there. I remember Jeffrey, the 40-year-old squatter that lived at the local park when I was a little girl. I remember how he would sit up in the treehouse, pornography in hand, that oddly intrigued smile on his face the first time he saw me. I remember how I would have been friends with anybody at the time, and how he stuck to me like glue when he realized that I was going to be an easy friend to him, an easy victim. I remember how scared I was to tell my parents about him, afraid that I would never see him again, never share another conversation with my new friend. I remember the way he crawled into my window like some desperate beast of a human, and the way he gave me my first kiss, and the way he bloodied my bed sheets that night as I tried to stay quiet, not about to lose my friend to my parents. To this day, they say nothing about the experience, because a piece of me suspects that they think I've forgotten, that by telling me my memories must be lies, then I'd have imagined it. Confabulation, the act of lying, something that they've done my entire life.
For some people, the thought of getting a job at one of those large marine mammal parks might be an amazing experience. But as we learn from author T. Ryoko, when your job is only meager janitorial duties, the attraction is more drudgery than excitement. Narrator Elle Bentley reads the tale for us as we find out how one woman discovered that there are more than sharks to fear at her work. There are other things to worry about in the aquarium.
About a month or two ago, I picked up a job at the local seaside aquarium. It's nothing special, just a minimum wage job mopping the floors and cleaning the glass so that everything will be clean when the morning comes. Work starts at 2 p.m. There's a lot of ground to cover, but the task is mundane enough that getting overstressed isn't an issue. No, it's not the work that frays my nerves. It's what's in the tanks. 2 people work the night shift. Jared, a kid straight out of high school, and me. We usually start at the entrance and then split up from there. He takes garbage duty with all the outside pens, and I take the inside complex solo till he finishes up enough to help me. He's a nice enough guy, shy around girls. I could barely get a word out of him when we first met, but his work skills make up for his muteness. Together, we are the night crew, and between us, I thought everything would be all right. Things changed a month in. That's when I started noticing the puddles that kept appearing in rooms I'd yet to mop, places I'd yet to step. They would make trails around the floor tiles, like something was flopping around like a fish out of water. I'd check the tanks, and with no leaks and cracks, they'd all be in order. After a few days of this, Jared and I would ask our boss about it, see if maybe one of the pipes busted and was leaking through the floor, but she assured us that that couldn't be the case. She assured us that all the pipes and systems, including the water tank, were well maintained since that certain incident happened a few years back. We had to trust her because we both knew what she was talking about. As much as the aquarium tries to deny it, us locals will never forget how 10 years ago one of the workers shoved his screaming daughter into one of the maintenance tanks. Jammed her in there till she was a contorted mess to let the salt water choke her out and rot her bones. Strangely, no body was actually found, just floating pieces of her flesh in a waterlogged dress. "We take better precautions now," my boss simply told me, then ushered us on our way. Despite all her assurances, it didn't stop the water from building up in the most random places. And in the days to follow, my annoyance slowly turned into a rising dread as I began to notice that the puddles were beginning to follow me, like wet footprints shadowing my own. Those thoughts were beginning to get to me, especially as the puddles began getting closer and closer to me as each night went by. It got to the point where I would have Jared with me all the time, because they seemed to keep their distance whenever he was around. Needless to say, I felt a bit embarrassed about asking to be escorted, but I could see it in his eyes that he was beginning to think I was a little paranoid, and paranoid was something I didn't want to be. So, as an attempt to calm my nerves, I would bring my iPod with me, plug it into my ears, and let the music be my company as I mopped dark hallways full of half-lit tanks and the flickering shadows of the creatures that inhabited them. The turning point happened that night when we were walking through the tube, made entirely out of glass and going straight through a massive shark tank. It was one of the main attractions. There aren't any lights in the tube, so we had to bring our own. I remember how I would wave my flashlight away whenever I saw a shark, as if that was the scariest thing I would see that night. My headphones were on, an old 60s ballad serenading my ears, when I noticed it. A second set of words singing underneath the lyrics, something I never heard before. It was enough to make me stop and listen to the eerie, echoing second chorus. It wasn't until Jared slipped off my headphones did I realize the voice wasn't coming from my iPod. I can't remember what I was thinking right then. Maybe I was too scared to think at all. I knew something was right behind me, something making my mind scream at me to keep walking till I was out of there and safe at home. But I turned around anyway. A wall of black made up the entrance to the tube, my flashlight too far away to pierce it. The high-pitched, animalistic wail slowly choked out. Then, nothing. Jared and I looked at each other, and I could tell he was almost as pale as I was. We were both drowning in the silence. Someone had to make a decision and do it fast before we both lost our minds. A minute passed. Then...
"Don't worry, I'll go check it out,"
Jared said more words to me than he had ever uttered throughout our entire janitorial career together. "How about we just keep moving? That side's clean, no need to go back there," I replied, sounding more frightened than I wanted to.
"I know how much you hate the dark, so you can stay put. It'll be all right."
was all he said before he vanished into the shadows, leaving me with nothing but a flashlight and 2 mop buckets. So I stood there in the tube, enduring the longest 30 minutes of my life. The sharks lazily swam around me, sometimes brushing up against the glass and causing me to jump. It was like they were watching me, waiting for something to happen. A little past a half hour, I heard it, the telltale drip of water cascading off a wet body and onto the floor. Something was at the end of the hallway, standing right at the edge of the shadows. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. Just standing there as a puddle formed beneath it, looking at me. My brain did the first thing it could think of. I raised the flashlight like a weapon. Hello? It moved fast. All I saw was a pale blur before pain erupted in my chest. I screamed as I fell backwards, the flashlight clattering away from me. My head cracked into the mop bucket, spilling dirty suds across the glass. Whether it was water or blood on my face, I didn't care, because darkness was suddenly upon me and I was very, very alone. I needed to get the flashlight. My priorities were simple as I wrapped my fingers around it and turned it back on. Find Jared. I found something else instead. It was banging its head against one of the fish tanks, beating out a dull rhythm till black blood began to trickle down the cracked glass. Nothing but sickly folds of skin with no bone definition. It just sat there, bent and stretched arms tucked into its side like fins, cysts leaking pus over boils and odd cuts. Slowly, it turned to me, whatever left of its spine creaking in protest as it bent in a way no human should. I swear my heart stopped at that moment as I stared through the ragged, salt-bleached hair and stared into the contorted and bloated face of a little girl. Its jaw hung half-dislocated from its face, the tatters of a familiar dark blue sweatshirt hanging from its slimy maw as it gaped at me stupidly. Jared? I dropped the flashlight. The thing pounced, knocking me against the ground with a sickening thud. The last thing I saw before my eyes closed was the rippling form of the creature, girl, whatever it was, bite the cover off a vent and disappear into it with a wet slurp. A few mildly concerned paramedics and an incredibly annoyed boss were hovering over me when I finally awoke. Apparently, I was at fault for delaying the opening of the aquarium, but for some reason I didn't quite seem to care. They found Jared, half shoved into one of the water treatment tanks. Miraculously, he was alive. I barely remember how hard I gripped his arm as we were rolled into the ambulance together. I was babbling, trying to explain what happened, but my words were always met with sympathetic faces and questions of how hard I hit my head. My boss merely shushed me, whispering the words I've been hearing since the day I was hired. Don't worry, we take better precautions now. Those precautions were to fire Jared and me, and stick us with the bill for fixing the cracked tank. Now I'm spending my summer moving inland, where dirt and trees replace sand and salt water. Jared and I are keeping in touch, though he hasn't uttered a word since that night. I think he likes hanging around, so I might ask him along. But I don't sleep anymore. I lie awake at night listening to the sink drip as I imagine the water running through the pipes in the walls. I have nightmares of drowned little girls, shoved to the bottom of my water tank and rippling monstrosities dripping down my stairs. And sometimes, I wake up to a puddle of water at the end of my bed.
Our episode has come to an end. Thank you for spending time with us at the No Sleep Podcast. If you would like to learn how you can hear the full-length version of this episode, featuring many more stories, please visit the nosleeppodcast.com and click on the Season Pass link. Purchasing a Season Pass will help support everyone who contributes to the podcast, and in return you'll get 25 full-length episodes and 3 exclusive bonus episodes, all for only $19.99. This is David Cummings. Thank you for listening, and join us again for the next episode of the No Sleep Podcast. Hi folks, this is David, the producer of the show. I want to make a short announcement and felt it would be better to do it right at the start for reasons which will soon become clear. I have recently become the focus of a very small yet very vocal group of people who feel they can dictate to me the type of content I use on the podcast. In spite of my efforts to include things like trigger warnings, it seems to these people that unless I flag virtually any form of content which could be considered disturbing to anyone, I am being negligent and harmful to our listeners. I feel I need to be perfectly clear about the kind of show this is to those people who seem unfamiliar to what a horror fiction podcast is all about. From the very beginning of the podcast, I have had a disclaimer on our website stating the graphic nature of its content. The episodes are marked as explicit on iTunes. Until now, I have felt that was enough warning. However, I now feel that I must provide a clear and unambiguous warning at the start of each show in order to remind people that it is their personal responsibility to guard what they expose themselves to, if, in fact, they are sensitive to certain themes. I will continue to provide trigger warnings when I feel they are warranted, but those warnings have been and will continue to be for only the most graphic imagery, not implied imagery. I will also continue to act as story editor and refuse to allow stories on the podcast which I feel cross the subjective line of good taste. To date, we have produced well over 350 stories in the almost 4 years of this podcast, and except for a very small number of them, I feel like the stories we have produced have walked the right side of that fine line between genuine horror and tasteless filth. So, from now on, before the start of the theme music, you will hear a disclaimer. I felt it was important that our regular listeners understand that the podcast is not changing in any way. The stories are not going to suddenly become more graphic or more hardcore. I simply need to let everyone know that they are forewarned and listen to this podcast of their own volition. And now, the disclaimer. Warning: this is a podcast of horror fiction. It is intended for a mature adult audience. The stories presented here are intended to disturb. They are likely to contain death, graphic violence, explicit sex, including imagery of sexual violence, hate crimes, blasphemy, or other themes and images that disturb. We assume by your listening that you wish to be disturbed for your entertainment. If there are themes that you cannot deal with in fiction, that are too strongly personal to you, please do not listen. If you feel that any particular episode is moving in a direction you are not comfortable with, please do yourself a favor and turn it off. In other words, brace yourself for the No Sleep Podcast. As the sunlight fades to darkness, the frightful tales creep into your mind. It's time to give in to your fear. Because Tonight, there will be no sleep. Brace yourself for the No Sleep Podcast.
He says I scream, kick, bite, and scratch while I'm completely asleep. I scream so loud the neighbors have called the police, thinking I was being beaten or stabbed.
I reached the end of the aisle and noticed to my left what looked like a hatch that led down to a basement. I had already decided that I was going to try something unorthodox with Bill. As a matter of fact, it was to begin the following day from my conversation with Martha that evening.
I don't quite remember where I was headed or why I had crashed, but I do remember plowing it into a telephone pole.
Breaking from my trance, I hurled the rest of the rope into the water and fled into the woods.